Fantasy VII is a classic that echoes through the ages, so it's unsurprising that after years of demand, the remake trilogy is panning out to be a critically acclaimed reimagining of the tale. But years before any of these games existed, or even the 1997 PlayStation original for that matter, it appeared that the game was heading for a different system entirely. This was because, if you know your gaming history, you'll remember that Final Fantasy wasn't always tied to Sony. In fact, there was a time when the idea of Final Fantasy VII launching on the PlayStation was unthinkable. After all, every major entry in the series had been exclusive to Nintendo consoles. Bearing this in mind, this raises the question: how did Square go from being one of Nintendo's strongest allies to delivering one of the biggest betrayals in gaming history? Well, strap in, because today we're diving into the murky past of Final Fantasy VII in its earlier days, as a Nintendo game that almost was. With that said, I am Lady Decade. Subscribe if you love gaming history, as this is the insane story of Final Fantasy VII for the Nintendo 64. Final Fantasy VII was amazing in 1997 and is great fun to play even now. Trust me, I just beat the original again only last week. It holds up very well. Use my affiliate link to get 54% off the PC version of this all-time great, reducing the price to just $6.29. Or if you want to revisit this legendary game in its modern form, I can get you up to 46% off of the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, so you can experience the retelling of Cloud's story at a bargain price. If you're watching this, then you probably love RPGs just as much as I do, and I've got some great news for you. Final Fantasy XVI Complete Edition is 21% off, and there's currently 55% off Chrono Trigger, 59% off Tactics Ogre Reborn, and for those of you who still haven't played Persona 5 Royal, it's an absolute steal at 73% off. So if you want to grab some classic and modern RPGs for just a fraction of what they normally cost on Steam, check out the deals in the pinned comment and a video description before they disappear. Final Fantasy VII was a game changer with a legacy that speaks for itself. Fast forward 28 years and Final Fantasy VII is still one of the most iconic games of all time. It sold 12.8 million copies and is synonymous with the original PlayStation. To understand how that all came to be, we need to talk about Hironobu Sakaguchi, the mastermind behind Final Fantasy. Before earning his place in gaming royalty, he was just a guy hopelessly obsessed with wizardry on his Apple II. By 1986, he had landed a job at Square, and with the rising success of Dragon Quest, he managed to sweet-talk the company into letting him take a crack at making his own RPG. And so, Final Fantasy was born, drawing inspiration from classics like The Legend of Zelda and Ultima. The series quickly became a powerhouse, churning out 3 games on the Famicom and another 3 on the Super Famicom. By this point, it seemed like a no-brainer that Final Fantasy VII would land on Nintendo's next console, but as history has shown, things didn't quite go as expected. By April of 1994, development on Final Fantasy VII was already in motion. The plan? Another Super Famicom release, making it the 4th Final Fantasy game on the system. Given that Final Fantasy VI, or 3 if you were in North America, had been hailed as one of the greatest RPGs of all time, a follow-up was inevitable. But still, things had changed behind the scenes. Now Hironobu Sakaguchi had shifted into a producer role, leaving the directorial duties for this future release with Yoshinori Kitase, a move that made perfect sense as Kitase had already co-directed Final Fantasy VI and had more than proven himself to Square. By 1995, gaming magazines were buzzing with excitement over the next Final Fantasy, and speculation was running wild. GameFan confidently claimed that Final Fantasy VII would boast SGI-style graphics like Donkey Kong Country and launch on a 64 megabit cartridge. Except that was almost certainly nonsense. Screenshots from this early Super Famicom build, later revealed in the Final Fantasy 25th Anniversary Ultimania, show the game still using traditional 2D sprites. In fact, if you look closely, you can even spot Final Fantasy VI's Locke standing in as a placeholder character. Then, out of nowhere, development hit a wall. Square put Final Fantasy VII on a back burner, shifting its focus to an even bigger project, Chrono Trigger. With Square and Enix teaming up and Dragon Ball creator Akira Toriyama handling the artwork, it was one of the most ambitious JRPG collaborations ever attempted. So there is no Final Fantasy VII yet, but once Chrono Trigger was finally complete, a game many still hail as the pinnacle of Super Nintendo JRPGs, the Final Fantasy VII team was free to return to their project. But by this point, it had already started transforming into something very different from what was originally conceived. Early ideas for Final Fantasy VII went in all sorts of directions, including a story set in a New York-inspired city. One scrapped concept even featured a sorceress named Edea, a name that should ring a bell as she later made her way onto the Final Fantasy VIII cast. Another version of the game took a wildly different approach, following a detective named Joe on a mission to track down a group responsible for bombing Midgar. While Joe never made the final cut, the themes of urban terrorism and corporate corruption clearly survived. Even elements of Parasite Eve can be traced back to discarded ideas from this phase, showing just how much Final Fantasy VII's development experimented before locking in its final vision. All sorts of ideas were left on the cutting room floor. By 1995, with the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn already on the market and doing relatively well, Square started having second thoughts about sticking with Nintendo. The Nintendo 64's delay raised concerns, but there was a bigger problem looming. Director Yoshinori Kitase saw the writing on the wall. 3D gaming wasn't just a passing trend, it was the future. With 3D graphics quickly becoming the industry standard, Final Fantasy risked looking outdated if it clung to its 2D roots. And if Square wanted to keep up, they had a massive decision to make. Stick with Nintendo's restrictive cartridges or embrace the new era of CD-based gaming. So rather than get left in the dust, the 2D version of Final Fantasy VII was scrapped, and in its place, the team set out to build something far more ambitious, a fully 3D RPG unlike anything the company had attempted before. This wasn't just a simple facelift. If Final Fantasy VII was going to keep up with the rapidly evolving industry, it had to be bigger, more cinematic, and more technically advanced than anything Square had ever produced. To pull it off, the company assembled a team of around 120 artists and programmers, armed them with Power Animator and Soft Image 3D, and threw a jaw-dropping $30 million at the project, an amount practically unheard of for a video game at the time. Square's first big step was to create an experimental tech demo, Final Fantasy SGI, running on Silicon Graphics Incorporated's Onyx workstations. This was the same high-end technology powering Nintendo's upcoming Ultra 64, later renamed the Nintendo 64, giving us a rare glimpse at what a 3D Final Fantasy on Nintendo hardware might have looked like. The tech demo featured real-time polygon-based battle footage showcasing familiar faces from Final Fantasy VI, including Terra Branford, Locke Cole, and Shadow. While it was never meant to evolve into a full game, it remains a fascinating relic, a glimpse into a world where Square and Nintendo still seemed destined to stay partners. But as we know now, that's not how things played out. At the time, everyone assumed Final Fantasy VII would land on Nintendo hardware, but behind the scenes, things were far more complicated. Even as Square experimented with SGI technology, they hadn't actually committed to the Nintendo Ultra 64. The industry was in the middle of a seismic shift from 2D to 3D, and for a company like Square, masters of sprite-based RPGs, this transition wasn't so much exciting, it was more downright nerve-wracking. After all, 3D development was a massive gamble. Square knew that if they got it wrong, they could single-handedly sink one of their biggest franchises, so before choosing a platform, they had to tread carefully and weigh their options. So, with that said, let's weigh up those options. On paper, in many ways, the Nintendo 64 seemed like the obvious choice. Every major Final Fantasy game had been exclusive to Nintendo systems, and fans naturally expected the series to stay put. Due to this, jumping to a different platform was obviously a massive risk, one that could alienate the game's loyal audience, but just because something feels like the safest option doesn't always mean it's the right one. The biggest red flag? Cartridges. While the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation had fully embraced CD-ROMs, Nintendo stubbornly clung to cartridges, and for a game as ambitious as Final Fantasy VII, that was a nightmare. Square now face a tough decision: stick with Nintendo's outdated format and risk being shackled by its limitations, or take a leap of faith and move to CD-ROM technology, which offered far greater storage and flexibility. We all know how that turned out, but at the time, nothing was set in stone. For Square, a case was mounting up that developing Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64 wasn't just inconvenient, it was a logistical nightmare. Cartridges were expensive to manufacture, laughably small in terms of storage, and downright primitive compared to the CD-ROMs used by both the PlayStation and Saturn. Simply put, Square's vision for a massive cinematic RPG was too big for a Nintendo 64 cartridge without making painful compromises. And they soon made that crystal clear to Nintendo. As more and more facts about the Nintendo 64 became available, tensions between Square and Nintendo were reaching breaking point. Square wasn't happy, and they made sure Nintendo knew it, particularly Shinichiro Kajitani, Vice President of Square USA. Kajitani repeatedly warned Nintendo that CD-ROM technology was the future, and without it, the Nintendo 64 would struggle to support large-scale JRPGs. He later claimed that Square had given Nintendo plenty of good advice, all of which was ignored. Reportedly, when Square approached Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi to discuss their concerns, he refused to listen. That was the moment Kajitani knew Square had to look elsewhere. But there was one final glimmer of hope. The Nintendo 64 disk drive is an add-on designed to expand the console's storage capacity. However, there are still two major problems. First, even with the 64DD, the storage still couldn't compete with what CD-ROMs offered. Final Fantasy VII was shaping up to be a massive cinematic RPG, and the limitations of the 64DD would have forced Square to make major compromises. Second, Nintendo hadn't even provided development kits for the 64DD, meaning that Square had no hardware to work with. They were being asked to pin their hopes on a product that didn't even exist yet, but they would still give the strange device a chance. Square experimented with the Nintendo 64DD, and it quickly became clear that the hardware simply wasn't up to the task of running Final Fantasy VII. One of the biggest red flags, the Behemoth test. But what even was this? To gauge how the console handled complex 3D models, Square created a 2000 polygon model of the classic Behemoth enemy from the series. The result was disastrous. The Nintendo 64 just couldn't handle it, leading to dreadful frame rates that made it clear the system wasn't powerful enough for Square's vision. And then came the real deal breaker: storage. By Square's calculations, Final Fantasy VII would have required 30 Nintendo 64DD discs just to fit all the cutscenes, music, and gameplay data they wanted to include. That was completely impractical. The game had simply outgrown Nintendo's hardware. Hironobu Sakaguchi later admitted that the project had spiraled beyond what they originally envisioned, saying, "Using a lot of motion data, CG effects, and still images, it turned out to be a mega capacity game, and therefore we had to choose CD-ROM as our media. In other words, we became too aggressive and got ourselves into trouble." The choice became clear. Given the Nintendo 64's severe storage limitations and the PlayStation's vastly superior CD format, well, Square had to leave. In 1996, Square publicly announced that all future projects, including Final Fantasy VII, would be PlayStation exclusives. This was one of the biggest defections in gaming history, a decision that would reshape the industry for years to come. Even Tetsuya Nomura, who was still relatively low in Square's hierarchy at the time, vividly remembers the moment. I remember walking down the hall when Sakaguchi-san stopped me and said, "Hey, look at this." He turned around and showed me the PlayStation logo on the back of his jacket. I stood there dumbfounded. This wasn't just a big move for Square, it was a devastating loss for Nintendo, one that would haunt them for years to come. Once Square committed to PlayStation, they wasted no time in making it official. To promote the transition, Final Fantasy VII director Yoshinori Kitase recalled that Square placed a massive ad in Shonen Jump magazine, a publication with a staggering 6 million readers. Combined with a powerful TV ad campaign, Square ensured that Japan fully associated Final Fantasy VII with Sony's console. Nintendo had lost its golden RPG franchise, and PlayStation was officially now the new home of Final Fantasy. But here's the plot twist. Sony came to Square, not the other way round. Many assume that Square abandoned Nintendo purely because of Sony's superior technology, but according to Square Vice President Shinichiro Kajitani, Sony made the first move. The former VP states that Sony approached Square directly, asking if they wanted to develop 3D games for the PlayStation, essentially offering them a lifeline as gaming transitioned away from 2D. And once Square started comparing the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation hardware side by side, the choice became painfully obvious. During the comparison phase, Hiroshi Kawai, a character programmer at Square Japan, tested both systems. One test involved bouncing 2D sprites around the screen and measuring how many polygons each system could process in a 60th of a second. The result, the PlayStation crushed the Nintendo 64. Even without textures or lighting, he claimed that the PlayStation could handle more than double the polygon count of the N64. Kawai didn't mince words when he later concluded, "There is no way you could have anything close to the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy VII on a Nintendo 64. But to make the choice even more obvious, Sony made an irresistible offer. You see, hardware wasn't the only factor in switching sides. Sony sweetened the deal financially as well. Tomoyuki Takechi, Square's president at the time, revealed that Sony didn't just offer better technology, they also made Square a financial offer they couldn't refuse. Sony's publishing deal for Final Fantasy VII was the best it had ever given to any third-party developer. Considering how well Final Fantasy sold in Japan, it was clear that Sony saw this as a golden opportunity to make the PlayStation the go-to console for RPGs. With better technology, a better financial deal, and more creative freedom, Square's decision was practically made for them. According to Tomoyuki Takechi, while he couldn't reveal the finer details, Sony significantly lowered per-unit royalties for Square, making it a far more attractive deal than anything Nintendo would have ever considered. And Nintendo did not take the betrayal well, leading to Square and Nintendo's relationship becoming hostile. So what would go down behind the scenes next? Well, it seems that leaving Nintendo wasn't just a business decision, it sparked a cold war between the two companies. Shinichiro Kajitani later revealed that Square employees were even banned from Nintendo's offices for an entire decade, as Nintendo now saw Square as the enemy. According to reports, when Square informed Nintendo of their departure, the response was brutally simple: "If you're leaving us, then never come back."
Get out. Get out. I mean it.
Former Square president Hisashi Suzuki explained that Nintendo wasn't immediately concerned about losing Final Fantasy VII, but the real damage would obviously come later. Square's defection to PlayStation sent a clear message to other developers: you don't have to stay loyal to Nintendo. This had massive consequences, as it convinced many other developers to jump ship, including Enix, the company behind Dragon Quest. And Kajitani was right. The Nintendo 64 never became a major home for JRPGs. Without Square or Enix, the genre simply wasn't there, leaving Sony's PlayStation to dominate in the RPG space. Final Fantasy VII became a defining moment for PlayStation. While Square and Nintendo's falling out was a big deal, Final Fantasy VII became the best-selling game in the franchise's history and the first mainline Final Fantasy game to release in Europe. Looking back, it's almost impossible to imagine a smaller, weaker version of Final Fantasy VII running on a Nintendo 64 hardware, but if things had played out differently, that could have been the reality we ended up with. Now, if this video has put you in the mood to play some classic JRPGs, remember that some of the best deals on these legendary games are still live right now. You can get over 50% off the classic Final Fantasy VII, huge money off Rebirth and Remake, 21% off a Final Fantasy XVI Complete Edition, 55% off Chrono Trigger, 59% off Tactics Ogre Reborn, and a ridiculous 73% off Persona 5 Royal. There are thousands of great deals to take advantage of through my affiliate link. Or, if you want to support what I do in a more personal way, access my behind-the-scenes cosplay library, including my Tifa cosplay shoot, by becoming a backer over on Patreon. Subscribe, and I'll see you all again soon.